Tonight, we drift into a galaxy far, far away, where love bloomed against impossible odds, and two hearts found each other amidst the chaos of rebellion and war. This is the story of Han Solo and Princess Leia, a tale woven from starlight and stubbornness, from courage and unexpected tenderness. As you settle into your pillows and let your breathing slow, allow yourself to be carried into their world, where smugglers become heroes and princesses discover that sometimes the most unlikely person can capture your heart completely. Our story begins not with grand declarations or fairy tale meetings, but with the kind of encounter that changes everything while seeming like nothing at all. Picture, if you will, the corridors of the Death Star, cold and metallic, humming with the menace of the Empire's greatest weapon. It was here that a cocky smuggler first laid eyes on a princess who would turn his entire universe upside down. Han Solo had never been one for royalty. Growing up on the streets of Corellia, scrapping for every meal and every credit, he learned early that fancy titles and noble blood meant nothing when you were hungry. He trusted his blaster, his ship, and very little else. The Millennium Falcon was his home, his freedom, his ticket to anywhere the Empire couldn't follow. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that got people killed in his line of work. But destiny, it seems, had different plans entirely. When Luke Skywalker approached him in that cantina on Tatooine, babbling about rescue missions and old wizards, Han saw only credits, 10,000 plus whatever they could salvage. It was supposed to be simple: pick up passengers, drop them off, collect payment, disappear into hyperspace. Just another job for a man who lived job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. The moment he first saw Princess Leia, everything he thought he knew about himself began to crumble like ancient stone. She stood in that detention cell, chin raised in defiance despite her circumstances, her white dress somehow pristine, even in the depths of the Death Star's bowels. When Luke announced they were there to rescue her, she didn't swoon or weep with gratitude. Instead, she looked Han up and down with those sharp brown eyes and asked with perfect disdain if he was perhaps a little short for a stormtrooper. Han had been insulted by pirates, crime lords, and imperial officers. He had been shot at, chased, and betrayed more times than he could count. But somehow, this slip of a princess, with her cutting wit and unshakable composure, managed to get under his skin in a way that no one ever had before. She was infuriating, impossible, and absolutely magnetic. As they fought their way through the Death Star's corridors, something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two stubborn souls who refused to bend, meeting their match in each other. When she grabbed Luke's blaster and started shooting, leading them into the garbage compactor with the confidence of someone born to command, Han found himself watching her with something that might have been admiration, if he had been the type to admit such things. The princess, for her part, was equally confounded by this scruffy smuggler, who seemed to care about nothing beyond his next payment, yet had risked everything to pull her from the Empire's grasp. Leia Organa had been raised in the halls of Alderaan's royal palace, surrounded by diplomats and senators who spoke in measured tones about duty and sacrifice. She understood protocol, politics, and the weight of responsibility that came with her title. What she didn't understand was Han Solo. He was crude where she was refined, selfish where she was selfless, chaotic where she was controlled. He challenged her at every turn, questioned her decisions, and seemed utterly immune to both her rank and her royal bearing. It was maddening. It was also, though she would never admit it, thrilling. Their escape from the Death Star was only the beginning. As they fled through hyperspace toward the rebel base, they found themselves thrown together in the cramped confines of the Falcon. The ship that was Han's sanctuary became their shared space, filled with tension that crackled like electricity between them. Every conversation was a duel of words, every glance a challenge. Leia tried to maintain her royal composure, but Han Solo had a way of stripping away pretense that left her feeling exposed and strangely vulnerable. When he called her, "Your worship," with that infuriating smirk, she wanted to throttle him. When he looked at her, like she was just a woman instead of a symbol of the rebellion, something deep inside her chest fluttered with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The rebel base on Yavin 4 became their temporary sanctuary, but neither of them seemed able to find peace. Han told himself he was only staying for the money, but the money came and went, and still he remained. Luke needed him, he reasoned. The kid was green as grass, and twice as naive. Someone had to keep him alive long enough to blow up Death Stars and fulfill whatever destiny the old wizard had rambled about. But late at night, when the base grew quiet and the jungle sounds filtered through the ancient stone walls, Han found his thoughts turning not to Luke's safety or the rebellion's cause, but to a certain princess who seemed determined to carry the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders. She worked too hard, slept too little, and never seemed to allow herself a moment's peace. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. Leia, meanwhile, discovered that having Han Solo around was like trying to ignore a thunderstorm. He was loud, unpredictable, and absolutely impossible to dismiss. He questioned her orders with the casual insolence of someone who had never learned proper respect for authority. He lounged in strategy meetings like he owned the place, making suggestions that were either brilliant or insane, sometimes both. Worse still, some of those suggestions actually worked. His smuggler's knowledge of Imperial patrol routes proved invaluable. His contacts in the underworld opened doors that diplomacy couldn't touch. Slowly, grudgingly, Leia began to see that beneath his roguish exterior lay a sharp, tactical mind, and, perhaps more surprisingly, a man who cared far more than he pretended. The Battle of Yavin had changed them both. When Han returned at the last moment to save Luke from Vader's pursuit, Leia felt something shift in her chest, like tectonic plates realigning. This selfish smuggler, who claimed to care only about money, had risked everything to save her friends, her cause, her hope. As she placed that medal around his neck, their eyes met and held, and for just a moment, all her carefully constructed walls trembled. Han felt it too, that moment when her fingers brushed his neck and her smile was soft instead of sardonic. Something warm and terrifying bloomed in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding entanglements, keeping everyone at arm's length, trusting no one completely. But this princess, with her fierce heart and unwavering courage, was making him want things he had never dared to dream of. The months that followed were a dance of advance and retreat, of walls built and slowly, carefully torn down. They argued constantly, their debates echoing through the corridors of whatever base the rebellion called home that week. But somewhere between the shouting matches and the strategic planning sessions, between the dangerous missions and the quiet moments of shared exhaustion, something was growing between them. It was Leia who first began to see past Han's carefully constructed facade. She noticed how he always volunteered for the most dangerous missions, claiming it was for the money, but never asking for payment. She saw how he looked after the younger rebels, gruff and complaining, but always making sure they had what they needed. She watched him work on the Falcon with tender precision and began to understand that for all his talk of freedom and independence, Han Solo was desperately lonely. Han, meanwhile, was learning that Princess Leia was far more complex than her royal title suggested. Yes, she was brave to the point of recklessness, throwing herself into danger with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt her own convictions. But in quieter moments, when she thought no one was watching, he caught glimpses of vulnerability that made his chest tight with unfamiliar emotions. She grieved for Alderaan with a pain so deep it seemed to echo in her bones. Yet she never let that grief slow her down or dim her determination. She carried the hopes and fears of countless rebels, making decisions that could mean life or death for thousands, and somehow found the strength to keep going when lesser people would have collapsed under the weight of it all. The more time they spent together, the more Han found himself wanting to ease that burden, to give her moments of peace in a galaxy that seemed determined to deny her any rest. He started bringing her calf when she worked too late, staying nearby during strategy sessions in case she needed backup for her arguments with the more cautious rebel leaders. Small gestures that he told himself meant nothing, but that felt increasingly important with each passing day. Their relationship deepened through shared danger and quiet moments stolen between battles. When they were assigned to the same missions, they developed an almost telepathic understanding, anticipating each other's moves with the fluid grace of partners who had learned to trust completely. Han's reckless bravado was tempered by Leia's strategic thinking, while her careful planning was enhanced by his ability to improvise when things inevitably went wrong. In the quiet spaces between missions, they began to truly see each other. Han shared stories of his youth on Corellia, painting pictures of a boy who had learned to survive through wit and stubbornness, who had never had anyone to depend on but himself. Leia spoke of Alderaan's beauty, of the parents who had raised her with love and duty in equal measure, of the weight of responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders before she was old enough to understand what it meant. They discovered they were both exiles in their own ways. Han had been running from the Empire, from his past, from the possibility of caring too much about anything or anyone. Leia had been forced to watch her world burn, to smile diplomatically while her heart shattered, to be strong when strength felt impossible. In each other, they found someone who understood the particular loneliness of carrying secrets, of being responsible for more than themselves, of never quite belonging anywhere completely. The evacuation of Hoth marked a turning point in their relationship, though neither would admit it at the time. As the rebel base crumbled under Imperial assault, they found themselves thrown together once again in the Falcon's cramped cockpit, fleeing into the unknown with the Empire in pursuit. The asteroid field that should have been their death became their sanctuary, a hidden cave where time seemed suspended and the outside universe faded to whispers. It was there, in the belly of a space slug, with the galaxy hunting them, that their carefully maintained barriers finally began to crumble. Without the constant bustle of rebel activity, without meetings and missions, and the comfortable distance of their public roles, they were simply Han and Leia, two people trying to survive another day in a hostile universe. The repairs to the Falcon became an excuse to work side by side, their hands sometimes touching as they reached for the same tool, their conversations growing softer as the artificial day cycle wore on. Han found himself stealing glances at Leia when she wasn't looking, watching the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when frustrated. These small, human moments felt more precious than all the medals and ceremonies in the galaxy. Leia, meanwhile, was discovering sides of Han she had never seen before. Away from the swagger and bravado he wore like armor, she found a man who was surprisingly gentle, who spoke to his ship like she was a living thing, who worried about Luke and Chewbacca with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had found his family among the stars. She began to understand that his cynicism was a shield, protecting a heart that had been bruised too many times by betrayal and loss. The medical droid's ministrations after Luke's encounter with the Wampa had left him weak and recovering, giving Han and Leia more time alone together than they had ever shared. They talked late into the ship's night cycle, their conversations meandering through philosophy and memory, dreams and fears. Han spoke of places he had seen in his travels, worlds of impossible beauty that existed far from the war's reach. Leia described the gardens of Alderaan, the way the morning light had danced through the crystal formations, the sound of her mother's laughter echoing through marble halls. These conversations felt like gifts, precious moments of vulnerability shared in the darkness of their hidden refuge. They were learning each other's languages, the way Han's jokes masked deeper truths, the way Leia's formality sometimes cracked to reveal the passionate woman beneath. They were falling, though neither would say it aloud, into something that felt both inevitable and impossible. When C-3PO interrupted what might have been their first real kiss, both of them stepped back with hearts racing and excuses on their lips. The moment felt too fragile, too important to rush. They had fought so hard against this connection, had denied it for so long, that acknowledging it felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown space. The arrival at Cloud City should have been a refuge, a chance to catch their breath and plan their next move. Instead, it became the crucible that would test everything they had built between them. Han's old friend, Lando Calrissian, welcomed them with smiles and celebration, but Leia's diplomatic instincts sensed undercurrents of tension that made her uneasy. Han, meanwhile, was torn between relief at finding sanctuary and growing concern for Luke, who had disappeared on some mysterious mission to Dagobah. The Force was still largely incomprehensible to him, but he had learned to trust Luke's instincts, and something felt wrong about their separation. The weight of responsibility he had never wanted was settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The dinner with Lando should have been pleasant, a brief respite from months of running and hiding. Instead, it felt like a performance, with everyone playing roles they didn't quite believe. Leia's political training helped her navigate the conversation with grace, but Han could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes never stopped cataloging exits and potential threats. When Darth Vader emerged from the shadows, like a nightmare given form, the fragile piece of Cloud City shattered like spun glass. The betrayal cut deep, not just Lando's reluctant treachery, but the realization that they had walked into a trap meant specifically for Luke. The Empire hadn't been hunting them randomly. They had been herded here like animals, their friends used as bait for a larger, more sinister purpose. In the carbon freezing chamber, with Vader's mechanical breathing echoing off the walls and stormtroopers surrounding them with weapons drawn, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Han was being lowered toward the freezing apparatus, and they both knew he might not survive the process. The chamber was cold, but not nearly as cold as the fear that gripped Leia's heart, as she realized she might lose him before they had ever truly found each other. This was the moment when all pretense fell away. No more walls, no more careful distance, no more protecting themselves from the possibility of pain. Han looked up at her from the platform, his face reflecting the same desperate realization that was tearing through her chest. They had wasted so much time, so many opportunities, dancing around feelings they were both too proud or too scared to name. When she called out those 3 words that had been building inside her for months, her voice breaking with emotion she had held back for too long, Han's response wasn't the echo she might have expected. Instead, he gave her something more precious, more true to who he was. His acknowledgement wasn't flowery or romantic in any traditional sense, but it was utterly, completely Han. It was confidence and tenderness and a promise, all wrapped together in the most perfectly imperfect response imaginable. The carbonite froze him mid-smile, that cocky grin that had infuriated and charmed her in equal measure, now preserved like a work of art. Leia pressed her hands against the cold metal, her reflection distorted in its surface, and felt something inside her chest crystallize into absolute determination. She would find a way to bring him back. She would move mountains, face down the Empire itself, tear the galaxy apart if necessary. But first, they had to survive. Luke's arrival brought chaos and lightsabers and the revelation of truths that shook the foundations of everything they thought they knew. In the midst of battle and betrayal, with the city falling apart around them and TIE fighters screaming through the clouds, Leia had to make the hardest decision of her life. Leave Han behind in Boba Fett's grasp, trust in the possibility of rescue, and focus on the larger war that still needed to be won. The flight from Cloud City felt like tearing away part of her soul. Every hyperspace jump took her further from Han, further from the chance to intercept Fett's ship and attempt some desperate rescue. But Luke needed medical attention. The rebellion needed leadership. And sometimes love meant making the choice that felt like death to ensure the people you loved had a chance to live. The months that followed tested Leia in ways she had never imagined. Leading the rebellion without Han felt like fighting with one hand tied behind her back. His strategic insights, his knowledge of the underworld, his ability to find solutions where others saw only problems, all of it was gone. Worse still was the simple absence of him. The way her eyes still searched for his face in every briefing room, the way she still turned to share a private joke or rolled her eyes at something only he would appreciate. But Leia Organa had been forged in the fires of loss and responsibility. She channeled her grief into determination, her fear into action. If the Empire thought capturing Han Solo would break the rebellion's spirit, they had vastly underestimated the fury of a princess who had found her heart and had it stolen away. She threw herself into planning and strategy, into building the coalition that would be needed to strike back at the Empire's greatest weapon. Yet in the quiet moments, in the spaces between battles and briefings, she allowed herself to remember the way Han's eyes lit up when he was planning something particularly reckless, the sound of his laugh, rough and genuine, usually at something C-3PO had said without meaning to be funny, the careful way he maintained the Falcon, his hands gentle on controls that had carried them all to safety, more times than she could count. She remembered their arguments, too. The way they had challenged each other, pushed each other to be better than they thought they could be. Han had never let her hide behind her title or her royal training. He had seen through every diplomatic deflection, every carefully constructed wall, straight to the woman underneath. In return, she had called him on his cynicism, his deliberate blindness to his own heroic nature, his refusal to believe he deserved the loyalty and love he had earned. The rescue plan that eventually took shape was vintage rebellion, equal parts desperate courage, and barely organized chaos. But at its heart was something deeper than military strategy or political necessity. It was love made manifest, friendship transformed into action, the simple truth that no one gets left behind, echoing through every detail of the operation. The palace of Jabba, the hut, was a monument to excess and cruelty, a sprawling complex carved into the rocky cliffs of Tatooine, where the twin suns beat down mercilessly in the desert winds, carried whispers of ancient secrets. Here, in this den of thieves and murderers, Han Solo hung suspended in carbonite, a trophy in the crime lord's collection. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew his story. The man who had spent his life running from entanglements, avoiding commitments, keeping everyone at arm's length, was now literally frozen in place, waiting for rescue he couldn't even know was coming. Leia's infiltration of the palace required her to become someone else entirely. Princess Leia Organa, diplomat and rebel leader, had to disappear beneath the mask of Bausch, a bounty hunter as ruthless and mysterious as the desert itself. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the armor and voice modulator helped. It was psychological, a complete reimagining of herself as someone who belonged in Jabba's world of violence and greed. Standing before that carbonite slab in the depths of Jabba's palace, seeing Han's face frozen in that eternal moment between defiance and surrender, Leia felt her heart fracture and reform simultaneously. Months of uncertainty crystallized into absolute certainty. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would free him. The rebellion could spare her for this mission, because some things transcended even the greatest causes. Some connections were worth risking everything to preserve. The process of freeing someone from carbonite was delicate, requiring precise temperature control and careful monitoring. One mistake could cause permanent damage, could turn a rescue into a tragedy. Leia's hands moved over the controls with steady precision, but her heart hammered against her ribs as the machinery hummed to life. This was the moment when hope would either be fulfilled or shattered completely. When the carbonite began to melt away and Han's body slumped forward, still caught between frozen sleep and waking consciousness, Leia caught him with arms that trembled despite her best efforts to remain calm. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, his eyes blinking in confusion as his nervous system slowly remembered how to function. The hibernation sickness that accompanied carbonite freezing left him disoriented, temporarily blind, struggling to piece together where he was and how much time had passed. But even in his weakened state, when she whispered his name in the darkness of Jabba's palace, Han's face turned toward her voice like a flower seeking sunlight. His hand reached out, fumbling, seeking contact with something real and warm and alive. When their fingers intertwined, when she felt the familiar calluses from years of piloting and maintenance work, something inside her chest that had been held tightly closed finally relaxed. The reunion was necessarily brief. Stolen moments in the belly of the beast before discovery and capture separated them once again. But in those precious minutes, they managed to communicate everything that months of separation had made crystal clear. The careful distance they had once maintained now seemed not just foolish, but impossible. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers they faced, they would face them as partners in every sense of the word. Jabba's throne room was a circus of depravity, filled with creatures that represented the worst the galaxy had to offer. Slavers and spice dealers, assassins and mercenaries, all gathered around their bloated host, like parasites feeding on corruption. When Leia was dragged before the crime lord in chains, forced to kneel at his feet in the humiliating costume he had chosen for her, the symbolic weight wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was a princess of Alderaan, a leader of the rebellion, reduced to decoration for a gangster's amusement. But Jabba had made a fundamental miscalculation. He saw only what he wanted to see, a beautiful prize to add to his collection, another symbol of his power over others. He failed to recognize the steel beneath the silk, the way Leia's eyes never stopped calculating angles and distances, the careful way she tested the strength of her bonds when she thought no one was watching. Princesses of Alderaan were raised to be many things. Decorative objects were not among them. Han, meanwhile, was learning to navigate blindness in a world that had become infinitely more dangerous. His other senses, always sharp from years of smuggling and survival, began to compensate for his temporary loss of sight. He could identify people by their footsteps, gauge moods by the tension in their voices, map the throne room's layout through sound and smell, and the subtle movements of air currents. The smuggler's instincts that had kept him alive through countless close calls were adapting to this new challenge with characteristic resourcefulness. The sail barge expedition to the Sarlacc pit was meant to be Jabba's grand entertainment, a chance to demonstrate his power by feeding his enemies to the desert's most patient predator. The great beast waited in its sandy crater, tentacles writhing with anticipation, beak clicking with alien hunger. For 1,000 years, it had fed on whatever the desert provided, and now it would feast on rebels and heroes while Jabba's court applauded from the safety of their floating platform. But the crime lord had underestimated his prisoners in every possible way. Luke Skywalker had returned from his training with abilities that bordered on the miraculous. His connection to the Force deeper and more controlled than anyone suspected. Lando Calrissian had spent months infiltrating the organization, earning trust while planning betrayal. And Leia, despite her chains and costume, remained every inch a warrior princess, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The battle above the Sarlacc was chaos in its purest form, a swirling melee of blasters and lightsabers, screaming aliens and exploding machinery. Luke moved through the combat like a dancer, his green lightsaber weaving patterns that seemed almost too beautiful for violence. Lando fought with the desperate courage of a man seeking redemption, his actions speaking louder than any apology. And in the midst of it all, Han Solo, still half blind, but guided by instinct and fury, settled old scores with the kind of precision that reminded everyone why he had survived so long in the galaxy's most dangerous profession. When Leia wrapped the chain that had bound her around Jabba's throat, when she used her own imprisonment as a weapon against her captor, the symbolism was perfect and intentional. The princess, who had been reduced to decoration, became the instrument of the crime lord's destruction, proving once again that underestimating Leia Organa was a fatal mistake. The massive Hutt's death throes shook the sail barge, But Leia held on with grim determination until his struggles ceased. The destruction of Jabba's barge was spectacular. A pillar of fire rising into Tatooine's harsh blue sky like a funeral pyre for tyranny. As they escaped in Luke's commandeered skiff, racing across the desert toward the waiting Falcon, Leia finally allowed herself to believe that the worst was over. Han was free, his sight gradually returning as the hibernation sickness faded. They were together again, whole again, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. But even as they celebrated their victory and mourned their losses, the galaxy was preparing for its final confrontation between light and darkness. The Emperor's new Death Star hung above the forest moon of Endor like a mechanical moon, its super laser capable of destroying entire fleets with surgical precision. Intelligence reports suggested it was nearly complete, that soon the Empire would possess a weapon that could end the rebellion with a single devastating blow. The mission to Endor was assigned to a small strike team, volunteers all, who would infiltrate the forest moon and destroy the shield generator protecting the Death Star. It was the kind of desperate gamble that the rebellion specialized in, the sort of mission where success meant survival and failure meant the end of everything they had fought to protect. Han Solo found himself appointed to lead the ground assault, a responsibility that sat uneasily on shoulders more accustomed to looking out for himself and his ship. Leia, of course, volunteered immediately for the mission. Wild Banthas couldn't have kept her away from what might be the war's decisive battle. But more than duty drove her decision. After coming so close to losing Han permanently, the thought of being separated again, of waiting in safety while he faced danger, was unbearable. They had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. Now, they would see this through to the end, together. The forest moon of Endor was a world of towering trees in dappled sunlight, of hidden paths and ancient secrets. The Ewoks who inhabited its canopy were primitive by galactic standards, but their knowledge of their world was complete, and their courage, once earned, was absolute. Building an alliance with them required patience, diplomacy, and a willingness to see past surface differences to the common ground beneath. It was here, among the giant trees, in rope bridges of the Ewok village, that Han and Leia finally found moments of peace to explore what had been growing between them for so long, away from the constant pressures of military command, from the endless cycle of briefings and battles. They could simply be two people who had found something precious in each other and wanted to protect it from a galaxy that seemed determined to tear them apart. Their conversations during the quiet hours before the final battle were different from the verbal sparring matches that had characterized their early relationship. The sharp edges had been worn smooth by shared danger and mutual respect, leaving something deeper and more sustainable. They talked about the future they hoped to build together, about worlds they wanted to visit when the war was over, about the strange twist of fate that had brought a smuggler and a princess together among the stars. Han spoke of his dreams for the Falcon, modifications he wanted to make, routes he wanted to explore in a galaxy finally free from Imperial tyranny. Leia shared her vision of reconstruction, of building something better from the Empire's ashes, of governments that served their people instead of enslaving them. They were different dreams, born from different backgrounds and experiences, but they complemented each other like binary stars locked in orbital dance. The night before the assault on the shield generator, As they sat together on a platform high in the Ewok village, with the forest spreading endlessly below them, they finally spoke the words that had been building between them for so long. Not the desperate declaration forced from them by approaching death, but quiet acknowledgments of feelings that had grown deep and strong and unshakable. Love, they discovered, wasn't always the passionate fire of romantic stories. Sometimes it was the steady warmth of a reliable flame, something that burned bright enough to light the way through darkness, but steady enough to last through whatever storms might come. What they had built together was strong enough to survive separation, patient enough to wait for the right moment, and deep enough to anchor them both through the chaos of war. The morning of the assault dawned clear and bright, the forest alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. But beneath the surface tranquility, the machinery of war was grinding into motion. Imperial scouts patrolled the forest paths. The shield generator hummed with deadly energy, and somewhere above the atmosphere, the largest space battle in galactic history was about to begin. As they prepared for what might be their final mission together, Han and Leia made a pact that had nothing to do with military objectives or rebel strategy. Whatever happened, whatever the cost, they would find their way back to each other. The galaxy had tried to keep them apart before and failed. Now, with the end of everything they had fought for hanging in the balance, their love had become not just personal, but symbolic, proof that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The forest battle that followed was unlike anything the rebellion had ever attempted. Imperial technology met primitive weapons in a conflict that seemed to belong to different eras entirely. But the Ewoks fought with the fury of defenders protecting their home, and the rebels fought with the desperate courage of people who knew this was their last chance for freedom. Through it all, Han and Leia moved as partners, covering each other's weaknesses, amplifying each other's strengths. The princess, who had once criticized the smuggler's reckless methods, now provided the tactical thinking that turned his improvised plans into viable strategies. The smuggler, who had once dismissed her royal protocols, now understood that her diplomatic training was just another form of combat, equally valuable in its own way. When the shield generator finally exploded in a pillar of flame that could be seen from orbit, when the Death Star's protective barrier flickered and died, they stood together, watching their victory burn against the forest sky. Above them, the space battle raged on. But the tide had turned. The Empire's greatest weapon was vulnerable, and the rebellion's fleet was pressing home their attack with everything they had. The celebration that night in the Ewok village was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in decades. Music and laughter echoed through the forest canopy as beings from 100 different worlds joined together in joy and relief. The Empire wasn't destroyed, not yet, but its back was broken. The Death Star was gone, the Emperor was dead, and for the first time in a generation, the galaxy could imagine a future without fear. As Han and Leia danced together beneath the stars, surrounded by friends and allies who had become family, they felt the weight of years lifting from their shoulders. The war that had brought them together was ending, but their story was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the complex work of building peace from the ashes of tyranny. But tonight, they had each other. They had hope, and they had all the time in the galaxy to discover what came next. The stars above Endor had witnessed the birth of the new republic, the restoration of freedom to countless worlds, and the triumph of love over darkness. In their ancient light, the future stretched out like an uncharted hyperspace route, full of possibilities and promise. And somewhere, in that vast expanse of space and time, a smuggler and a princess continued their greatest adventure together, writing their love story across the stars themselves. The years that followed brought a different kind of adventure, one measured not in parsecs traveled or battles won, but in quiet moments stolen between the demands of a galaxy rebuilding itself. Han found himself appointed to positions he never wanted, medals hanging in closets he rarely opened, his name spoken with respect in senatorial chambers where he still felt like an imposter. The transition from smuggler to respectable citizen was harder than any hyperspace jump he had ever made. Leia threw herself into the work of governance with the same fierce determination she had once brought to rebellion. The new republic needed leaders who understood both diplomacy and warfare, who could navigate the treacherous waters of galactic politics while never forgetting the cost of freedom. She moved through council chambers and treaty negotiations with grace and authority, but Han could see the exhaustion in her eyes at the end of each long day. Their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. The desperate urgency of wartime romance gave way to something more complex and enduring. They learned each other's habits, the way Leia hummed absently when reviewing legislation, the way Han's hands never stopped moving when he was thinking. They discovered that love wasn't just about grand gestures and dramatic rescues, but about the small kindnesses that made daily life bearable. The Millennium Falcon became their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the pressures of public life and remember who they had been before the galaxy made them symbols. Han spent hours tinkering with systems that didn't need repair, finding peace in the familiar rhythms of maintenance and modification. Leia would join him in the cockpit, sometimes working on diplomatic correspondence, sometimes just watching the stars wheel past in their eternal dance. They talked about the future in those quiet hours, about the children they might have someday, about worlds they wanted to visit when duty no longer demanded every waking moment. Han described planets he had seen in his smuggling days, worlds of impossible beauty that existed far from trade routes and political boundaries. Leia spoke of rebuilding Alderaan's culture, of preserving the music and art and philosophy that the Empire had tried to erase forever. The galaxy they were helping to build was messier than either had imagined. Freedom, it turned out, was more complicated than rebellion. Former imperial worlds had to be integrated without alienating their populations. War criminals needed justice, but mercy was equally important for lasting peace. Every decision carried consequences that rippled across star systems, affecting millions of lives in ways they could barely comprehend. Han struggled with his new role as a respectable general in the New Republic military. The uniform felt strange on shoulders, more accustomed to smuggler's leather, and the deference shown by younger officers made him uncomfortable. He had spent his adult life trusting no one but himself, making decisions that affected only his own survival. Now, he commanded fleets, made strategic decisions that could determine the fate of entire sectors. The weight of responsibility was heavier than any cargo he had ever carried. But Leia was his anchor through the storms of transition. Her political instincts complemented his tactical thinking. Her patience balanced his impulsiveness. When the pressures of leadership threatened to overwhelm him, she reminded him of why they fought, of the difference between power over others and responsibility for them. When her own diplomatic duties left her feeling isolated and misunderstood. He brought her back to Earth with humor and perspective that cut through pretension, like a lightsaber through Durasteel. They married quietly, without the fanfare that their positions might have warranted. The ceremony took place aboard the Falcon, with Luke officiating and Chewbacca serving as Han's best man. Leia wore a simple white dress that reminded Han of that first day on the Death Star, when a princess had looked him up and down and asked if he was perhaps too short for a stormtrooper. The vows they exchanged were their own words, promises forged in the fires of shared experience and tempered by the knowledge of how precious and fragile love could be. Their honeymoon was a journey to the outer rim, to worlds that existed outside the reach of politics and protocol. They walked through crystal forests that sang in the wind, swam in lakes that reflected twin moons, sat by campfires on beaches where the sand was made of powdered starlight. For 2 weeks, they were simply Han and Leia, not General Solo and Chief of State Organa, not symbols of the new republic, just two people who had found each other among the stars. The return to duty was jarring, but they had learned to steal moments of connection, even in the midst of chaos. A touch of hands during boring committee meetings, shared glances across crowded reception halls, private jokes whispered in the corridors of power. They created their own language of intimacy that could survive even the most public scrutiny, a code that spoke of deeper connections beneath the surface of their official roles. Luke's growing mastery of the Force brought both joy and concern. His training on Dagobah had awakened abilities that sometimes seemed to transcend normal understanding, and his plans to rebuild the Jedi Order filled him with purpose that was beautiful to witness. But Han worried about his friend, about the weight of ancient expectations, and the loneliness that came with being the last of his kind. The Force was a mystery that Han had never fully understood, but he understood friendship, and he made sure Luke knew he wasn't walking this path alone. The birth of their son changed everything in ways they hadn't anticipated. Ben Solo entered the world during a diplomatic crisis that had kept both parents working around the clock, arriving with the same dramatic timing that had characterized his parents' entire relationship. Han held his child for the first time in a medical bay that still smelled of Bacta, an antiseptic, and felt something in his chest rearrange itself permanently. Parenthood was another adventure, one that required different kinds of courage than facing down Imperial Star Destroyers. Late-night feedings, first steps, the endless questions of a curious toddler who had inherited both his mother's intelligence and his father's stubborn streak. Han discovered reserves of patience he never knew he possessed, while Leia learned to delegate responsibilities she had once insisted on handling personally. And so, as the twin suns of Tatooine set once more and the stars emerge in their ancient patterns, we leave Han and Leia where love stories should end, not with dramatic declarations or impossible rescues, but with the quiet contentment of two souls who found their home in each other. Their love became legend, whispered in cantinas across the galaxy, proof that even in the darkest times, hearts can find light. Let their story carry you gently into sleep, where dreams of distant stars and endless possibilities await.